Hi, I'm Gary, and this is VV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking at vehicle to grid.
The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by Zaptec, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence.
So welcome back to the show and season 15 of the podcast. Now, by the end of this season, we'll be at 300 episodes of a show about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. Thanks to everyone who listens, subscribes, likes, comments, emails, anything to support the podcast. Thank you very much. Now, there's a couple of small changes to the show this season. Firstly, the timings are going to be different. Usually, the episodes are released to the public on a Monday afternoon at 5 p.m, and I'm moving that 24 hours earlier so that they all get released on Sunday at 5 p.m. More people are home at that time, and they can watch or listen in the evening or on their morning commute to work the following day. Secondly, I'm removing a complete segment of the episode. I'm getting rid of the cool EV or renewable thing that I do at the end of each episode. Now, it served me well for 14 seasons, but I think I'm probably going to give it a rest, at least for this season. We'll circle back at the end of season 15 and see whether that was the right decision or not. Let me know if you found that segment useful. I'd also like to welcome back Zaptec as the marquee sponsors of the podcast for another season. It's great to have their support again. And they've been instrumental in helping me grow the show and allowing it to expand. So thank you very much to Zaptec. Finally, I want to give you a heads up about a sister podcast that I'm producing that's only available on YouTube. There will be no audio version of it at all. It's called the Commercial EV Musings Podcast, and it's a B2B video podcast, business to business, which means it'll be covering topics and companies that are more focused on the business side of electric vehicles. Now, if you're new to EVs or thinking about EVs, it's probably not going to be of much interest to you. But if you work in the EV field, it might be worth taking a listen. It'll be updated less frequently than this main one, and all episodes will be fully sponsored by the companies who are taking part. The link to that podcast is in the show notes. Now, our main topic of discussion today is how you can use your electric vehicle to make you money and help the grid at the same time. And I'm talking about vehicle to grid. So what exactly is vehicle to grid, or V2G? Well, inside your electric car is, unsurprisingly, an electric battery. Now, there's power in that battery, and for most of the time, it sits outside your house doing, well, not a lot. But on the other side of the cable that charges it from the grid is a whole network of connectors, wires, and most importantly, electrical demand. Now, you'll have heard of this thing called the Dunkelflaut, which is a period of time where the sun doesn't shine and the wind is calm. Well, when that happens, the grid has to resort to various other tricks of the trade to generate electricity. For a lot of the time, they use things like BESS, battery electric storage systems, or gas peaker plants. But the thing about BESS is it's fairly expensive to build and it takes up space. And gas peaker plants are expensive to turn on and very expensive to run. So your electricity, as a result, becomes expensive. But at the same time, you've got potentially millions of electric vehicles just sitting there, connected to the grid with batteries that are doing, well, not a lot really. Wouldn't it be good if we could use the energy in those millions of EV batteries to power the grid? As the owner of the battery, you'd potentially earn money from the network operator, and the cost to them would be lower because the cost to them would be lower than switching on peaker plants or building big BESS systems. So in a nutshell, that's vehicle to grid. Now, of course, it's far more nuanced than that, and there are lots of questions around how it would work and what are the consequences and scaling it and standards and all that sort of stuff. So today I want to talk this through with someone who knows a little bit more about it than I do.
Yes, hello, I'm Paul Pschierer-Barnfather. I work for Zaptec, which is a Norwegian charge point manufacturer, and I work in product strategy.
We're talking about vehicle to grid today. Now, in the preamble to this, I've already talked a little bit to the listeners about what I think it is, but I'm not an expert on this, and you're probably more of an expert than I am. So can you give me your definition of vehicle to grid, please?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many definitions, so I'll try and keep it general. I mean, vehicle to grid is being able to take energy out of your vehicle and then connect that energy to the grid. The clue is in the title. That might involve you using it in your home. It might not, and that's where it gets a little bit complicated. But when we say vehicle to grid, we mean that the vehicle is connected to the grid and is able to pull power from the grid and, more importantly, give it back, basically acting like a big battery buffer system. So that's vehicle to grid. That's the idea. Obviously, making it work is technically complex, but that's the idea.
So that then raises the question of what is the fundamental difference? Because you mentioned, maybe being able to use the energy in your battery in your house. So how does that differ from the concept that is currently available in a larger number of vehicles, especially the Korean ones, which is vehicle to load, where you've actually got a 3-pin plug somewhere on the vehicle and you can run an extension cable and run some parts of your house off that. What's the fundamental difference there?
So vehicle to load is you can get that now. I mean, unlike vehicle to grid, which is not quite there yet. Vehicle to load, there's loads of vehicles that got that, and that means that they can supply power to what we call an islanded load. And that, by definition of islanded, means it's not connected to the grid. So if your house is connected to the grid, you can't use that feature to power your home. If your house is not connected to the grid, islanded, completely disconnect from the grid, then you can. That's so vehicle to load is only works with something that's islanded, that's not connected to the grid, because the grid is very big. It's very, very powerful. You can't just connect to it and hope that it's going to work, because when we connect to the grid, the vehicle would have to respect what the grid is doing and follow what the grid is doing. It can't control what the grid is doing. If the vehicle versus grid wins. So there's a big difference between something that's powering a load under its own steam and can control what's going on. That's vehicle to load. That's quite simple. And being able to follow what the grid does in a safe and compliant way. So that's why vehicle to load is not vehicle to grid. Slightly different.
Now, I want to come on and talk a little bit about maybe get into the detail of how the vehicle to grid works and what we need to do in terms of hardware, software, etc., for that to operate correctly. But let's just take a sort of a step back and look at the big picture. Why is vehicle to grid an important concept when we're looking at electric vehicles?
Okay, so there's a couple of reasons. One is that the energy that's in your battery when your vehicle is parked on your drive has value. You can use it for stuff. You could use it to power your washing machine. You could use it to support the wider grid. So you've got this energy which you've paid for, and it's in your battery, and it's sat there doing nothing. Now, it may be that while your vehicle is stationary, somebody else wants to pay you for more than what it cost you to put the energy in there, and then arrange to put the energy back when it's cheap. So you've got this money maker sat on your drive. So if you're not using your vehicle, it sort of makes sense. Think, well, that's an interesting idea. I could sell electricity, and as long as I get it back in time for when I want to use the vehicle. So one concept there is, I could make money from it, which I think is driving a lot of the interest. But the bigger picture, if we zoom out, if we're going to power our charging from renewables and not fossil fuels, renewables, sometimes we've got too much renewable energy, sometimes we haven't got enough. And the main case for decarbonisation for electric vehicles, it's really, really strengthened when we charge from renewable energy, and it's also cheaper. So instead of just charging when I want to charge, but I charge when the energy is available, and then maybe give some of that back. So I charge when even if I don't need to, I could charge when the energy is available and then store it a bit and then give it back. Even if I'm not benefiting personally from that, what that means is we can use more of the renewable energy that we're generating, because you might be aware that in the UK we actually constrain off the renewable energy because we've got too much at times. This is madness. And if you've got vehicle to grid, what the power companies could do is they can put it in all vehicles and then pull it back at tea time when people are presumably not driving. And doing that means that we don't need to fire up the gas plants, which means that the electricity gets cheaper for everybody, not just you. So you've got this big, so you can see this sort of nirvana that if everybody's doing this, the renewable energy gets used more and more, the energy in your car is cleaner and cheaper, and the electricity price falls for everyone else. So it's kind of it's a very, very rare case of a win-win. So there's two levels there. There's the personal benefit, but also there's this wider system benefit, which benefits you even if you haven't got an EV. So that's the reason why governments kind of get involved in pushing V2G. It's not just about the individual use case, although that's a really good one.
So, given what you've just said, what is the potential scale of this? So how many cars, how many electric vehicles could potentially be linked into the grid through a vehicle-to-grid system?
Ooh, I mean, numbers are always difficult on a podcast because, but we've got is it there 30 million cars in the fleet, something like that? Apologies if that's wrong, because I'm going to pluck figures out the air, and most of those at any one particular time are stationary, and most of those are going to have 50 kilowatt hour plus battery packs, and of which for vehicle to grid, obviously you're not going to use the whole battery, you're going to use a bit of that. So you've got maybe 10 or 20 kilowatt hours to play with that won't get in the way of your plans. And so if you do the math, which I can't do in my head right now, but if you take 30 million times 10, 20 kilowatt hours, what that gives you is basically a gigantic power plant that's the equivalent of, and again, apologies if the numbers are slightly wrong, but it's more than one nuke power station. You've basically got this free power station that you can turn up and down, and it's the order of a few gigawatts. Well, in the UK, in case you're not familiar with the size of the UK system, the lowest load that we see is around 25 gigawatts, something like that, and it goes all the way up to nearly 50. It's that kind of. We've got just over 10 gigawatts of solar. So we peak at over 10 gigawatts of solar now in the UK on a sunny day. We've got, oh crikey, wind. It keeps breaking records, but I think it's more than 15. It's probably getting up towards 20 gigawatts of wind. So you've got all of that, and sometimes we have to turn it down by a few gigawatts because we've got nowhere to put it. Well, the vehicles, there are enough vehicles, or will be enough vehicles, to basically manage all of that problem, which means that we then don't need to build lots of really expensive battery banks and things like that. Obviously, we'll use those for fast support and frequency support and things like that. But it means that you've got this gigantic resource, which allows us then to build more renewables and allows us to further decarbonize. And so it's significant. Let's just put it in context for you. Pay overnight, you might be lucky enough to pay less than 10 pence a unit for your kilowatt hours. But your day rate in the UK is around 30 pence a kilowatt hour. Right, okay. Is that cheap or not? Well, the stuff coming out the wind farms is about 2 or 3, 4 pence a kilowatt hour. So you think, well, surely I'm being ripped off here. They're making I'm paying 10 times what the energy costs. No. The only reason you pay more is because of all of the other backup stuff and all the buffering and all of all the dispatch that's needed. And that's what makes the electricity price high in this nirvana where everything is following the renewables and the renewables are just doing their thing. Apart from the transmission costs, which is 5 or 10 pence a kilowatt hour. The rest of those costs disappear, the balancing costs. So you start to see substantial falls in your electricity bill. Not like 5% or 10%. It falls a lot. So that's the objective here, is basically bring your electricity bill down.
So you've talked about the nirvana there, and if we look at the situation where every vehicle on the road is electric and every vehicle on the road is vehicle-to-grid enabled and every vehicle on the road has the ability to put in 10 kilowatt hours, 20 kilowatt hours, etc. That is, the nirvana. But let's bring it back to the reality. Today, what's the actual situation?
You can't do it. That's the brutal truth. Vehicle-to-grid is very strange for me as an engineer because we, trying to convince people to use solar, trying to convince people to use EVs, the technology is sort of long since proven, and it takes years and years to build up enthusiasm and pull for the technology. Right now, pretty much anybody with vehicles says, when can I have vehicle to grid? Because you can't have it yet, which is kind of interesting how attractive something that's quite a technically complicated proposition really registers with people, and people kind of want this probably for all the reasons I've just described. But as of today, the unfortunate news is you can't buy a vehicle that will do vehicle to grid independently of the manufacturer. There are one or two that might do it if you're part of a manufacturer trial. For example, and the only ones with any capability that you can buy today, the Renaults, which have a nice onboard AC, but that will only work with their proprietary charger at the moment. So that's good, but we're not quite there. And the Volkswagen MEBs, unusually, this is completely unique, the Volkswagen MEBs with a 77 kilowatt hour battery pack, they will let you switch on the vehicle to grid over the DC port anytime. It's there on the menu. It's already there now. Fortunately, it's got a lifetime limit of 10,000 kilowatt hours. So unfortunately, that actually makes it I can come on to how useless that makes it. But interestingly, Volkswagen, fair play to them. They're the first ones to have released this. And they did it retrospectively on existing cars, which is incredibly unusual. I think even if you buy a car today, unless it's one of a very few select models, it is unlikely, unfortunately, to be able to do vehicle to grid ever. And that's really kind of frustrating because people want this now, but the battery technology, the tech that needs to be put on the car isn't quite there yet. It'll come. There'll be vehicles that can do this year, and the availability of this is likely to become more widespread next year. But as of today, the reality is it's outside of trials and outside of tightly controlled test rollouts. I mean, give you an example. In the UK, you can buy today a BYD that will do this from Octopus, from their Power Pack. Fantastic deal that is. But it only works with Octopus, and it only works with that BYD, and it only works within that controlled environment. So you can get access to V2G in the UK today through the Octopus Power Pack, but it's very, very boxy. You can't just go and buy a car that'll do V2G. We're not there yet.
But if I go back, 4-5 years, there have been trials with vehicle to grid, and I think the famous one was with the Nissan Leaf.
Yeah,
where you could use vehicle to grid on the Nissan Leaf, and I think there are quite a few people who were involved in that trial. But it needed a quite expensive home charger that was CHAdeMO compatible and all that sort of stuff. So they've been doing this for quite a while.
Yes.
Why are we not further on?
So the CHAdeMO vehicles obviously have been able to do this for years. I mean, when I say you can't buy them, I'm talking very much CCS vehicles there. Yeah, the CHAdeMO unusually never stopped you from doing this. So CHAdeMO, people have been able to use CHAdeMO based vehicles in trials for years, and there's been lots of really good learning from that, which has help to build the business case to work out what the technical challenges may be. But you're right, it's DC. So DC means you need an expensive DC wall box, which is still in the few £1,000s mark. So it's quite an expensive proposition. The handshake with the car to get it to kind of, export the power and whatever is relatively simple on CHAdeMO. With CCS, the manufacturers understandably want a lot more control over this, because it is possible to degrade your battery if you go silly with this. I mean, the reality is that real world V2G isn't going to involve charging your vehicle to 100% every day and discharging it overnight and discharging it to zero and charging it to 100% and discharging it to zero. While in theory you could do that, if you did, your battery would not last very long. So especially the NMC-based batteries. So there is a concern that, not that there is battery degradation, but you could harm the battery if it was completely unrestricted. So understandably, the vehicle manufacturers want to be able to control and limit what the vehicle can do. Obviously, if it's got LFP cells, it'll be a lot more happier to do this. NMC less so. It depends on the vehicle, and it also depends on whether the manufacturer actually designed the battery pack to do this. If you didn't design the battery pack to do this, which is what was the case with the Nissan Leafs, then doing this isn't going to help your battery life. If when you designed the battery pack, you said, oh, and by the way, we want to be able to do vehicle to grid and not to impact on the battery life, that's perfectly doable. But you needed to have asked that question when you were designing the battery pack. So what you're seeing now is, based on the learnings from that, the vehicles with the right design of pack-in, with the right provisions, are now coming onto the market, because that takes a few years. So all of those learnings are now coming in, and you should start to see it available. But these things take a while. You know, it's not as simple as just let me do whatever I want with the battery. That's asking a bit too much.
Indeed. So talk to me a little bit about this. This is the point where we put our technical hats on, because you've talked a little bit about battery chemistries and things like that. So what are the actual components that need to be in place, either from a hardware point of view in the car, from a software point of view in the car, from a hardware point of view in the charger, or from a software point of view in the charger, to make the vehicle to grid ecosystem work for an individual?
So there's a couple of ways of doing it. I'm going to only talk about modern CCS and Type 2 connectors. So that's the big DC connector that the cars have in Europe. So there's a couple of ways of doing it. One way is what we call DC vehicle to grid, where the two big pins in the port that you see there, you basically connect the battery terminal voltage to a reverse charger or inverter, so a big box on the wall, and that turns the DC into AC, which can then connect to the grid, and then you can get the power out of the vehicle in AC, an alternating current, which is what the grid uses. So we have to translate between battery voltage, which is DC, and grid voltage, which is AC. Don't need to know why. It's just that's it, and you need a box to do that translation. So there's quite a long chain there, and so first of all, you need a battery that's ready for this. But secondly, we need to be able to talk to, between the charger, the inverter, and the vehicle, we need to be able to say, okay, what have you got for me? How much power can you give me? Here's what, I can't give you this right now because I need to be 80% full by tomorrow or whatever. So that communication between the wall box, that is the thing that has been pretty much holding it up. There's a standard, I'm going to quote standard numbers at you, which is always
we love standard numbers
called ISO 15118-20. Which defines how this is done. And that was only released in 2022, which isn't very long in standards then. And that defines how you can do this with DC. And even then, there are still some gaps in the standard because it allows a lot of things to be optional at the moment. So things like the state of charge and the battery capacity are all optional. Not all the manufacturers make that data available. So it's kind of there, but not quite. And so there's a few kinks need to be worked out in the standard to make this just plug and play. So that work is ongoing now. Once you've got the battery and you've got the comms and then you've got this wall box, which is quite an expensive device, again, a few £1,000s. Then there's the grid code, because it has to connect to the grid code. We generally got that in the UK because it basically looks like a solar panel or something, very similar to a solar connection. So if you've got permission to connect to solar, if you've had to go through that permissions process, it's quite similar for a DC vehicle to grid. Once you've got all those things in place, that's good. So we're now able to connect to the grid safely and we can get power in and out. Good. Now we need to tell it what to do. And as I mentioned before, you personally might want to control it. That's fine. You can do that now. But then if the grid wants to control these things at scale with millions of devices, somebody somewhere needs to say, oh, can you charge now? Can you not charge now? And they need to do that in a standardized way. Well, that standard doesn't really exist yet. CPP 2.1, more standard numbers, does have all the commands in. Not many charge points have implemented that yet. It's still very new. But eventually that will allow your charge point to form part of this ecosystem where somebody can, send the commands to help it manage the grid, and your car will respond and it'll all just work. But those standards have been quite slow. So that's the DC picture, and it's great, and you can just about do that. And BMW are going to launch a service with that next year on the Neue Klasse, which is kind of cool. I think Mercedes are looking at. So you're going to see a few, but sticking point there is, a several £1,000 wall box. Somebody's got to pay for that. That's kind of, so it's nice, works technically, but commercially, not quite there yet. So there is another approach, which is the one that Renault have taken with the Renault 5, which is really clever. And that is you've already got an onboard charger on your vehicle that turns AC into DC. And you plug into your wall box, plug into a 7 kilowatt outlet like this one behind. And on the car, there's a box somewhere hidden in the car, which takes the AC, turns it into DC, charges the battery. Brilliant. We can modify that box to go both ways, to turn it into an inverter. So instead of putting a power AC into the car, we can take the DC out of the battery, turn it into AC, send it back out through the cable. That's AC vehicle to grid. Now, that modification inside the vehicle to do this is quite cheap. I mean, obviously, any change on the vehicles, but yeah, there's no like major new components. It's a small change to the inverter, so it allows manufacturers to add this capability into the vehicle for relatively little. You know, talking like tens of dollars here, literally in terms of components. It's not very much. You can see why. You think, well, okay. Instead of needing a whole new expensive wall box, what we could do is modify the onboard charger in the vehicle so that it can export 7 kilowatts or whatever. And that way it takes a huge amount of the cost out. Fantastic. You know, this then makes it commercially viable. So this is where Renault have gone, and I think others will follow. Great. Let's do that. You know, let's do that now today. There's a slight problem in that now we've got the AC inverter is on the vehicle, and that's the bit that's going to follow what the grid is doing. So now I've got to communicate to the vehicle exactly how it needs to behave with the grid. And then you think, but it's a vehicle. It could be in the UK this week, and it could be in France next week, and it could be in Germany after that. And all the grids are different. So in order to make this, you can see where this is going. So in order to make this work, the charge point has to say, well, actually, now you're in the UK, so what you need to do, car, is this, this, and this to comply in the UK. Can you do that and do all the handshake and the chit-chat? So that's what we are waiting for now. Now, the standard to do that, which am I going to give you the whole title? ISO 15118-20 AMD1. Yeah, was supposed to be out last year. And we were all, as manufacturers, we were all getting really excited, waiting for this standard, because then we can implement it in charge points, and the manufacturers can implement it. Let's get going. Fortunately, it didn't get through the draft stage. There was a lot of questions, a lot of challenges, a lot of argument from different stakeholders, and it's gone back. So we're still working on that. And in order to try and move this forward, there's now an international consortium called Task 53. So you can look it up on the internet and find that's a very excitingly titled group. And that group is basically working on sorting this problem out. So that's where we are. So can we do it technically? Yes. Can we do it commercially? 100%. The commercial use cases there now. What's missing is the standardization of the ecosystem to get all these bits to talk together. So that's all that's missing at the moment, but it's a significant part, and that's what we're working on. So it was a very long answer, but we're getting there.
Yeah, indeed. Now, given what you've just said, and notwithstanding the issues with standards, etc., as you said at the top of the conversation, we do actually have a project where this works, and it's the Octopus Power Pack. So it's BYD Dolphin Surf. Yep. Lovely vehicle. Drove one of those on the London to Brighton rally last year in the garish yellow. You need to be an Octopus customer, and you need something that you'll know all about, which is a specific Zaptec charger. So given what you just said about the complications, etc., how have you been able to make this work using those three components? So
as I said, the technology's there, the capability's there in the car if the manufacturer's made it, the control signals are there. When you've got an energy company like Octopus, they know exactly what they wanted to do. So in this world where there aren't the standards, what you can do is implement how you do this in a proprietary way, just in a hard-coded way. Send me the command to start, and the car starts, and the command to stop, and the car stops. So when you've got a single ecosystem which has got an energy supplier, the charge point manufacturer, and the vehicle, you can join all of those together, put a box around it and say, right, that works. That is the Octopus Power Pack. So if you do it in where you've got all 3 bits in one box, it works. And that is what the BMW Neue Klasse thing will be launched next year. Again, it's an energy supplier, it's a wall box, and it's a vehicle again. And what you will see is quite a lot of those launched in the next year where you are tied to a particular charge point and you're tied to a particular vehicle and you're tied to a particular energy provider. That's fine and that's great if that combination works for you. But obviously what we really want is for any vehicle to work with any charge point, to work with any energy provider. And that's where it really starts. So we're not at that stage yet. What we are at is where you can do it in a closed ecosystem. So that's exactly what the Octopus Power Pack is. So if you want it now, you're going to have to sign up to a closed ecosystem. But if that car, charger and energy provider works for you, happy days. You're in luck. You can have this now.
Now that raises a number of questions in no in no particular order. So, for example, you've talked then about the Octopus Power Pack, and it's a bundle. So you're effectively, when you get the bundle, you're getting the vehicle, you're getting the charger, you're getting the Octopus contract. Octopus are managing all that. It all gets installed. And, if I sort of summarize it, you're effectively a bystander in all this. Octopus deal with everything. You just plug it in and you get the money at the end of the month, etc. Excuse me. Now, let's assume I go out and I buy a BYD Dolphin Surf and I buy a Zaptec charger and I then go and speak to Octopus. Could they then make that work independently rather than going and buying the whole thing?
Not today. No.
Okay.
I mean, obviously that's what you would like. It would be nice to be able to do, but as I said, the comms protocols, the firmware, what's going on within the boxes is specific to this implementation. So there is some specific stuff that wouldn't be present on a retail. I don't know how. I can't speak for BYD to say how they've implemented it, but you wouldn't be able to access that as an end customer. Only they can access that. So that's the. Does that make it clear? So the capability is there within the physical vehicle. I don't think there's any physical changes, but unlocking the capability in the software at the moment is low.
Okay. So the next logical extension for that is, and I don't have a Zaptec charger. I have a Zappi from My Energy. Is there the potential for whatever it is that Zaptec do within their charger to enable that to happen, to also happen on a Zappi, so that at some point in the future there could be an Octopus Power Pack with a Zappi rather than a Zaptec?
That's a great question, Gary. So I mentioned before that when it is opened up to the point where you can mix and match or do it yourself, and that's where we want to be, there is one criteria that's needed for this, and that is that the charge point needs to be able to talk to the vehicle. There's got to be that comms link. Now, that comms link requires a specific piece of hardware, which I don't believe is present in the Zappi. It is present in the Zaptec Go 2, and I'm sure it's present in other chargers on the market. It's certainly present in the Zaptec Go 2, but there's a specific communications chip that has to be in the vehicle so that it can communicate all this stuff over the cable. And of course, the vehicle needs to have the same chip at the other end, but it's a hardware power line carrier communications chip that's needed. So I think you will increasingly see charge points on the market that have this capability to talk to the vehicle. So that's point one. So you need the communications chip, which I don't think your Zappi will have at this stage. So there'll be some upgrade needed there. Second thing is, if you're going to do it yourself or within your house, that's probably all you'll need. But if you're going to form part of the national energy system where you're doing this trading and the in and out, of course, that's a trade. You're getting paid for that, as you may, if you want to get paid for this stuff. So that means the energy flowing through the charge point has to be measured to an accuracy. Actually, you had a really interesting episode on accuracy, which I did listen to. And that has to be... there you go.
There we
Fantastic. Go. So obviously, if you're buying a certain number of kilowatt hours and selling a certain number of kilowatt hours back, and you're getting paid for that. It has got to be measured in, you can't just use some random kitchen scales for that. It's got to be a proper trading meter. So Your electricity meter in your home obviously has that accuracy, but that's not measuring what's going in and out your vehicle. And if you're getting paid specifically what's going in and out your vehicle, you need a meter in the charge point. And so, again, the Zaptec Go 2 has got both import and export mid-certified metering, which isn't fully wired into the UK law yet, and I'm sure your correspondent on the Accuracy podcast picked up on this, but it's coming. So in order to be a participant in this, our expectation or understanding is you will need a mid-certified meter because you're going to be transacting over it. So there's a couple of bits that are needed in the charge point to do this. So not yet with your Zappy, but next generation charge points I would expect have all of this stuff.
So let me put myself in a situation. There are people who listen to this podcast who are considering going to electric vehicles. They haven't made the decision yet. There may be somebody out there who thinks, right, in 6 months, I'm a BMW driver. I've got a BMW diesel. At some point, I'm going to move to an electric BMW. Probably going to be one of the Neue class ones that you've talked about. I also need a charger. If they go out and say, right, the charger that I want is going to be one of the Zaptec Go 2s that you've talked about. It's got the communication chip. It's vehicle to grid enabled. Even though there's nothing on the market at the moment that will allow the car to speak to the charger independently, is it worth their while making that decision to buy the Zaptec charger that's vehicle to grid enabled, on the understanding that at some point in the future that may happen?
It is, as long as the vehicle that you're buying, comes down to the vehicle that you're buying, if the vehicle that you're buying has the AC capability that I mentioned before, then yes, absolutely. If the vehicle that you're buying lacks the AC capability built in and requires an external DC wall box, which unfortunately applies to the Neue Klasse, then in order to access vehicle to grid, you are going to need to buy or get somebody to pay for a large expensive wall box. So what we're seeing is vehicles are increasingly being launched with the onboard AC capability, but at the moment it's only the BYD that you've mentioned and the Renaults have this capability and some others. But again, the manufacturers, I can't say too much because the manufacturers are a little bit quiet about it. I'm sure that in due course, the Volkswagens, the BMWs, and everything else will have this capability. But if you bought a Neue Klasse today, it hasn't got the AC vehicle to grid capability on it. If that is incorrect, BMW, and you've got it secretly in there and you just haven't told anybody, I apologise. But the likelihood is that because they haven't said that it does, I think we're fairly safe to assume that it hasn't got the new inverter AC charger. That will become, I would expect, the norm because, as I said, the price difference is relatively small on the hardware. So it's a tough call. If you were buying a charger and you thought, well, one day I'll have a vehicle, or when I swap the BMW, I'll have something else, and that will, then yes, that would be ready, absolutely. But at the moment, there aren't so many vehicles on the market that have this.
Okay. So let's move off the hardware and talk about the actual customer experience. Because I know Liz Allen will probably be listening to this, and she's a big fan of customer experience. So for somebody who has, we'll talk about the Octopus Power Pack. We'll use that as an example. What's actually in it for the customer? Because we've already identified that they don't really have any control over this. They plug in, it's all dealt with by Octopus, and there's going to be some money flowing back and forth. But is that the extent of the benefit for the customer? What's the actual?
So the way, again, the various trials do it differently. Generally, they're not giving you a monetary reward. What they're generally giving you in these vehicle to grid offers is free charging, because that, by taking the monetary transaction out of it, it really simplifies things. So there have been some interesting trials where monetary rewards have been given, and you get incentives for plugging in and things like that. At the moment, the sort of the three major trials that are available, which is the Octopus one in the UK, there's one in Germany and there's one in France. What those tend to do is they give you a guaranteed free number of kilometers per year, as long as you achieve a certain plug-in behavior. So I do have a presentation that explains the differences between all of these, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. But effectively, the Octopus one, I think it's 12,000. I think it's 12,000 miles a year, something like that. And actually, that's limited by the lease. So you can't do more than that. But if you plug in for a specific number of hours, and again, they all do it slightly differently. Sometimes it's hours within a 24-hour period. Sometimes it's hours within a week's period, whatever. There's some kind of behavior that you are expected, plug-in behavior that you're expected to do. So you're expected to leave your car plugged in. And if you do that, then you get the free miles. So that's generally how it works at the moment.
Okay. So I just want to go through some sort of rapid fire questions. And you've touched on a couple of these, but we'll just go through them quickly. Will this hurt my battery?
No.
Will I end up with an empty battery in the morning? And what's controlling that? Who's defining what the percentage is?
The way it works is the way it's expected to work is normally you've got a particular charge level. You want to achieve a charge level, so you set it to 80% or 100% or whatever. So you've set a charge level in your car, and it'll usually have a by this time. So by 8 a.m. or by 7 a.m. So whatever you've set in that's the thing that's used to drive this behavior. So if you've said, I need an 80% charge by 7 a.m. tomorrow, then that's what you will have. You will have an 80% charge by 7 a.m. tomorrow. And in between now and then, things will happen and energy will be taken from the battery, put back in the battery. As I said, you're not generally running the reason I said with confidence that it's not going to harm the battery is we're only talking 7 kilowatts maximum here. It takes, you'd be hard pushed to completely drain a modern battery and then fill it up again in the time that it's plugged in. It's not going to happen because it's not fast enough. So you can only withdraw a certain amount. And what you can do is a bit like Octopus already do with your charging plan. They say, well, you've got this much energy now and you need this much energy then. Here's what the wind and solar is going to do between. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you some energy now. And if you're on Octopus Go, you'll have seen it do this. It goes on and off and on and off while it's charging. Because where they've got spare power, they charge your car, and then as soon as the price goes up, they stop it and then it starts again. So it would do a similar thing, but instead of stopping and starting like the Octopus tariff does, what it will do is it will ramp up and ramp down and go negative. And it's just a more sophisticated way of doing that. And that by doing that, it allows them to drop the price from what's Octopus these days, 7 pence a unit. It allows them to drop that price to zero. That's how it works.
Okay. So what are because we've talked a lot about the benefits of this, we've talked a lot about the pluses, we haven't talked about any of the minuses. What are the downsides to vehicle to grid?
Well, the downside is you've got to leave your vehicle plugged in. So, so from a behavioural point of view, if you can't leave your vehicle plugged in, if the vehicle's in constant use, then it's not really able to. So it's not for everybody. But there are enough people who leave their vehicle plugged in for long, or stationary for long periods of time. So the difference is that you have to do is instead of leaving your vehicle on the drive, you leave your vehicle on the drive and plugged in. So that's the behavioural commitment that you have to do. The expectation is you don't change your behavior at all. You still use the vehicle in exactly the same way that you always did. It's just that if you remember to plug it in, you get this boost. And if enough people do this, which is the expectation, that then lowers the electricity price for everybody else who either has an EV or doesn't have an EV or can't leave it plugged in for whatever reason. It's only for specific use cases. But in the commercial space, the classic one in America is the school buses that do their school runs in the morning and then stay plugged in. And when they've done this, it's fantastic for vehicle to grid because obviously the things are basically a giant battery pack. And so they do grid services while they're parked in the depot and then do the school run basically for free. So post office vans are another fantastic use case for this because they tend to be very busy, very local, and then they stop. But most commercial delivery vehicles aren't used, 24 hours. They usually parked up at some point, so at which point they can participate. There are so it depends on the use case, but for people that have that use case, fantastic. And if you don't, well, you don't miss out because by doing this, it lowers the energy price for you. It's all good.
So given that, I don't know what the figure is, something like 90% of a vehicle's time it's spent not moving. Now, we've been talking primarily about an individual vehicle on an individual's drive.
Yes.
But of course, there are circumstances where people have parked their vehicles and it's not on their drive, but they may be plugged in. They may be plugged in at workplace charging. They may be plugged in you've talked about depot charging. They may even be plugged in on the 7, 11 or 22 kilowatt public network. Is there the opportunity to have a V2G aspect for those use cases?
Yeah, I mean, any time where you can do flexibility, where the vehicle is plugged in for longer than it needs to be just to achieve the level of charge. So obviously on a rapid, when you stop, not so much, because on a rapid, you want full power. There's no real flexibility there. So you're only plugged in for as long as you need to charge. So in that context, at that point, there isn't really any V2G. Obviously, you can do stuff if there's on-site batteries, but at that point, no. But where you are plugged in for longer than you need, so where the vehicle's going to achieve the desired target in the hours that you're there, then absolutely 100%. So certainly what we see for workplace charging is that vehicles are usually there all day for the 8 hours. Most of them have only, because they're going there each day, particularly in office commutes, they've only used a small amount of energy to get to work, and they're usually all charged by mid-morning. They're only charged for an hour or two. So in that circumstance, you've got all the rest of the day for doing this, and obviously if you've got on-site solar, then you can do lots of clever things. So there's wherever you've got a dwell time that's longer than needed to achieve the state of charge, then yes, you can do this. Where the dwell time doesn't give you any flexibility, no, you can't.
Of course, the use case that you talked about there with the workplace charging and solar is effectively the 3TI Papilio 3 use case, and we've had Mark Potter and the folks from 3TI on to talk about that in previous episodes, so I'll put a link in the show notes if people want to check that episode out. Paul, is there anything you'd like to say about V2G that we haven't covered before we finish?
I mean, as Zaptec, what are we doing? Why am I involved in this? Well, what we want is for this to work with any vehicle and any energy supplier. So this interoperability is key. I think it's fantastic that we're doing the closed trial with Octopus. The experience you get from that and the knowledge is brilliant. But for this to go really mainstream, because the more mainstream it gets, the better it gets. It's quite unusual. It's brilliant to do a small scale trial, but really what we want is millions. Now, to get to millions, it's got to be interoperable. And that is the focus for the industry in the next year or two, is get it to the state that you mentioned earlier on, which is, yeah, I can buy a car, I can buy a charge point, I can sign up with an energy provider, and it'll just work. No button pushing, no configuration. It just works. The building blocks are all in place. They've got some standards work to do, and the manufacturers have got some implementation to do. But that is the plan for the next year or two. And by then, we should be in a state where that's achieved. So that's our focus as a manufacturer, to get it interoperable and get it working seamlessly with any vehicle. And if we can get to that in the next couple of years, I'll be very happy.
Totally agreed. Paul, I think it's been a great discussion. We've talked about the customer, we talked about the hardware, we delved a little bit into the minutiae of the technical data. So something for everybody, I think. And I'd like to thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Gary. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
So here are the takeaways from that discussion. First of all the components are there at the moment for vehicle to grid. We've got a set of standards. We've got hardware that works. We've got software that works. It just needs a little bit more movement to standardize this across everywhere. Pilot projects and trials exist and have done for a while. And if you really want to take advantage of this today, you can get the Octopus Power Pack option, or at least go on the wait list for it. And I've put a link to that in the show notes in case you want to apply. Finally, the potential for vehicle to grid is huge. With all the vehicles and all the chargers set up to do this, anyone who parks their car and leaves it plugged in has the possibility to get either free charging for their car or to get payment for using the energy from the battery. And this has positive implications for grid stability, renewables build out, and for the demise of fossil fuels. Now, I thought this was a great conversation with Paul, and I hope you did too. Do you have any questions that came out of this discussion? If so, either leave a comment on YouTube or email me at info@evmusings.com.
The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by Zapmap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence. Zapmap is free to download and use with subscription plans for enhanced features such as using Zapmap in car, on CarPlay or Android Auto, and discounted charging across thousands of charge points.
I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. It was put together this week with the help of Paul Pschierer-Barnfather. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages, To pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. And on the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at evmusings, where I post short videos and podcast extracts regularly. So why not follow me there? Thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. If you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/evmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Now, regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks. So you've gone electric, and so you've gone renewable. First one of those has had a recent update. You'll see it with a bright red image on the front, just like I'm showing on the screen here. Both of those are 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on the Amazon Kindle store. Check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, I know you're probably driving or walking or jogging or in the shower or washing the car, but if you can remember and you enjoyed this episode, drop a review in iTunes, please. Really helps me out. I did go in and have a look recently at some of the most recent reviews. Thank you very much for those who took time to do that for me. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by messaging me at evmusings.bsky.social with the words V2G to L to H. Hashtag if you know, you know, nothing else. And thanks, as always, to my co-founder, Simon. You know, he's very keen to ensure that the highway code recognizes electric unicycles and that the riders themselves can align with specific requirements like the need to have full insurance and wear those bright orange high-vis jackets at all times. In fact, he put forward a policy document last year.
Fortunately, it didn't get through the draft stage. There was a lot of questions, a lot of challenges, a lot of argument from different stakeholders, and it's gone back.
Thanks for watching and listening. Bye.